I'm going to talk about the Black Heritage Trails at the V&A Museum. That we've been running them for quite a long time because the history of them is that the V&A Museum has about 12.5 acres of exhibition space, but they don't have any galleries that are dedicated to the Caribbean or Africa. And so they started these tours a few years ago because there are objects in the museum that are about Africa and the Caribbean, but they're dotted about. So we started a tour, which at the time was called the Hidden Caribbean, where we took people around to find these objects. And we've been doing that tour for a long time. But now, after lockdown, we've made it into a trail so that people are able to access it themselves. They can take their time, they can spend more time on each object as they like, and they can then click on the link and find additional information that are in the V&A's records. The trail now consists of 8 items. They illustrate the material culture of the Caribbean, but I've chosen to talk about 3 people, and the link is that they all travelled to Britain for their education, which was a very traditional thing to do for people of a certain class or people who had money, and sometimes if they didn't have money, they were sent by the government to train. The people from the Caribbean are real travellers. They travel everywhere. I think they started out by travelling from Africa. Under duress. So I think that's the link. So the 3 people are some of my favourites, and I use the objects to talk about the people. Item number 1, a skirt suit made for someone called Beryl Gilroy, who migrated from Guyana in 1951. I chose this particular item because a lot of black people will have something like this in their wardrobe, or something that belonged to their parents or someone like that. So I just use it as a sort of symbol in order to talk about Beryl, because that's the whole purpose of it. Beryl was born in 1924 in Skeldon, Berbice, Guyana, and she was raised in a sort of typical Caribbean way by her grandmother. And her grandmother was someone who practiced lots of things that are typically Caribbean, in that she was really involved in herbal medicines. She ran the sort of family smallholding that so many West Indian people have. And Beryl was unusual in that she was raised by her grandmother and educated by her grandmother in a way that would today be called experiential learning. So rather than being at school, she was taken around and shown things, and she didn't actually go into formal education until she was 12 years old. So when she went into formal education, she was way ahead of everybody else, and she sort of flourished, and she after a while she became a teacher herself and ended up teaching on a UNICEF course in the Caribbean. Eventually she was so good that she was selected to come to England to study, and she arrived here in 1951 wearing this suit to study at London University. The thing about this suit is that it's unusual in that it was made by someone called Nat Gaynes, a tailor, and in the Caribbean of those days it would be very unusual to find a tailor making something for a woman. All the roles were really carefully delineated, so almost every garment made for a woman was made by a seamstress. And what you do is you take your fabric, have it made, tell them how you wanted it made, and that's how the whole thing worked. And only tailors made things for men because it's tailored. I think tailoring is structuring it in the way a man's suit would be structured. When this is displayed in the V&A, it's displayed right next to a very, very sort of dark clothing which was being worn in Britain at the time. So it contrasts with what other people were wearing. So Beryl talks about the fact that when she arrived here, people stared at her for wearing this sort of brightly coloured, salmon coloured suit. People laughed at her. She also came with sort of lots of American fashion because the Caribbean is next to America, and that's where a lot of the cultural influences, a lot of the fashion influences come from. A lot of people didn't know very much about England at all. So Beryl Gilroy, she did her training, she did her course, she was very successful at it, but after finishing her training, she couldn't get jobs. So she worked as a teacher for a short time and eventually had to do things. She became a washer woman, she was a maid, and she worked as a clerk in a factory. And then, as in a typical way of someone who married in those days, she married an Englishman and went to work at home. She became what they would have called then a housewife, but what they would probably call now something very, very flashy. So she worked from home for 12 years. She looked after her children, but she didn't just work from home. She had a job. She was a reader for a publisher. So that means that if you wanted something publishing, it would be someone like Beryl who ended up reading it and suggesting how it could be changed. But she also continued her education at home. So she began to write herself. She wrote both fiction and non-fiction books. And after 12 years, she went back into education. And eventually she became someone who was known as one of the first black head teachers in Britain. And that's what makes her special. She didn't just become famous for that. She trained in psychology. She continued her education. She did a doctorate. She just did everything. And what I love about doing this tour live is that when I come to talking about Beryl Gilroy, and I normally mention her name towards the end, just for a bit of a bit of excitement. Towards the end, I get lots of screams saying, "Oh, we knew her," or "She was our headmistress," or "She was our teacher." She was really, really well loved. The other thing about her is that not only was she academic or sort of ambitious and valued education, her children, she had two children, and they both became very famous. They both became professors, and their name will be known by many of the audience. One of them, Paul Gilroy, he does everything. He studies everything. He's educator, cultural historian. He's famous for and has worked everywhere. And when I was a young teacher myself, I worked in a fashion college, and eventually lots of people that ask me would say to me, "Well, there aren't any black designers, are there?" And eventually I found the daughter, Darla Jane Gilroy, who was one of the first black designers I knew who functioned in the sort of way that other designers, she had her own label, she had her own shop. She wasn't just working from her bedroom, which is what a lot of people often have to do. So not only was Beryl this academic, but she loved fashion. That's why this garment is in the collection. So she donated it to the museum, and then she talked about how the other black women who she knew made their own clothing, or she talked about she made a suit, a dinner suit out of gingham, which is, for people who don't recognize gingham, it's the sort of tablecloth check fabric that you have in restaurants, and she said lots and lots of people remarked on it and couldn't believe that she did it. So I value her as someone to talk about and someone to show to people, because a lot of people don't expect someone like her as a migrant. Someone who is academic and studying and not just the typical migrant. The other thing about her that I value is that she was a woman. When talking about Black History Month now, lots of people are looking at men coming off the Empire Windrush, and that's the typical image you have. But Beryl, there were so many black women who came in that position. And in those days, it was a massive thing to do, to travel to the other side of the world on your own. So that's what makes Beryl special for me. The warrior bracelet is called the warrior bracelet, and you expect it to be something to do with, race and maybe a fight for freedom or something like that, but it's nothing like that. It's actually in the V&A, it's in the jewelry gallery. And the thing about the jewelry gallery, it's the blingiest gallery or the blingiest room you will ever see in your life. And it's probably the most expensive room you'll ever see in your life. And you walk along and you see everything glinting and shining. And I go to this which is a bracelet, and it's the most demure, the most modest piece of jewelry you'll ever see. If I wasn't sort of pointing to it, you might not really notice it, you know. But I think this is a wonderful bracelet because there are so many contradictions with it. First of all, bracelets are normally made of a shaft, which is normal and regular and equal, and they normally have two finials at the end, two terminals at the end, and those terminals are normally the same. But with this bracelet, one terminal is in the shape of a woman's head and the other terminal is in the shape of the hand. It's sort of made in a very realistic way, in the sort of Art Nouveau style, because the images are realistic. Normally they're sort of they're not with jewelry. It's unusual for jewelry. And this particular bracelet is made of ebony. The shaft is made of ebony, but when you look at it, it almost looks like a bit of rusted metal. You wouldn't recognize it as ebony. The significance of it being made of ebony is that it really relates to a lot of how black artists and craftsmen use their work. They often include ebony because it sort of signifies a connection to Africa. And it's sort of got a cultural significance now. So it's made of ebony, but it's sort of shaped ebony. The head of the woman is molded, but the details are picked out in silver. And then you've got some precious stones, one of which is called tourmaline, and the other one in the hand is an almandine garnet, which is a red stone. What's unusual about the materials used in this particular bracelet is that they are very organic. She includes some materials that you wouldn't ever see in jewelry. On the face of the woman, the carapace of beetles. So there's an area where you've got this sort of iridescent, greeny, bluey colouring on the face of this image, and that's actually made of beetle shell. And what's interesting about that is that that's a really typical way of making things in the Caribbean. It's not they use a lot of organic stuff because you know, you're surrounded by seashells and you're surrounded by exotic vegetation where you can use the seeds to make jewelry. Normally you call a lot of that sort of work found objects, but there's nothing really found about it. It's sort of recycling. One of the most important recycling materials or objects you find in the Caribbean really has become synonymous with being a Caribbean person, and that's the steel pan, because those are pans that arrived in the Caribbean carrying oils or precious liquids, and then they're discarded. And then the people who live there, often not having equipment, musical instruments of their own, started making them into musical instruments, and now they are the instruments that typify Caribbean music. So the thing about this bracelet is that it really references the past and the present, because in the past the actual bracelet reminds me of the Manila bracelets from our history, and the Manila bracelets were used as currency for buying enslaved Africans. But the shape of this bracelet reminds me of that. For a long time, the slave trade, as you call it, as people call it, was really pushed along by the fact that the people who were buying enslaved Africans were able to make these Manila bracelets. And that's what made the slave trade from something that was relatively small to begin with to something that was massive, because the Europeans who were buying enslaved Africans came back home to Europe and started making millions of these Manila bracelets. And then that really sparked off the slave trade, as people call it. So that reminds me, that particular bracelet reminds me of that. But it also reminds me of these bracelets that make a noise as you're talking, because if you were an enslaved African, you didn't have anything that was of any value to pass down. The people slept on mats on the ground. They were fed like, animals. They were, herded to their workplace, and there's nothing that they had that lasted. So most of the things you see in museums, for example, were passed down from the plantocracy. They're called the people who owned the plantations, the people who were enriched by the trade in African people. And so now, if you see a black person with an antique, they bought it because a black person in the Caribbean, because they were not able to have anything passed down to them. But when they started buying things, a lot of people bought these bracelets, and it's become for me something that identifies us as a people, because if I go anywhere and I see people wearing these bracelets, I know that they're from the Caribbean, and I have met strangers who say to me, "Oh, let me see your bracelets. Oh, I love those. I've got some and they were passed down from my grandmother or my great-grandmother or whatever." And it's almost traditional now that when a new baby is born and you want to give a present to that baby, you might buy a little tiny one. And I say they're the only sort of genuine antiques that we people from the Caribbean have. And they link us wherever we are. And in the museum, when we do the tour, when I mention this, I've often had people standing there in tears because they think about what they mean to us, and they think about the fact that they've actually got some. And there have been other people who've said, "Oh, my grandmother gave me these, and I put them in the drawer but I'm going straight home to put them on." And I've had people come back to show me on my next tour that they're wearing the bracelet. So I see it as a really unifying object. I include Francis William on my tours because he's one of my favourite characters. There's so much to say about him, and there's so much to find out about him. Who is this person? Why does he look like that? What's this whole thing about? Francis Williams was born in about 1700, and he died about 1770. With history, you're never quite sure, but we think he was maybe born 1702, sometime like that. He was born to parents who had been enslaved. John and Dorothy Williams had been enslaved, and strangely, they were able to buy their freedom. People often say, well, how can enslaved people buy their freedom? Well, often they might be growing plants or growing things, and when the ships arrived, they sold them. So these people unusually were able to buy their freedom. And so when Francis was born, they had 3 children, and when Francis was born, he was not enslaved. But that, I think, made his life very difficult, because you need to know where you are in society if you're to survive. And there he was in a culture where most people were, all the white people were not enslaved, and all the black people were, except Francis Williams and a few others. So it was very, I think he sort of stimulates me because his life is so different, and he just didn't fit in anywhere. So here was this person, his parents had been enslaved, and when they were freed, within 10 years they made a lot of money, so they were very, very rich. And as rich people, they did what the white rich people would do, which is they bought property, they bought everything that would say we are nouveau riche, and that included buying enslaved Africans. And that really surprises people. And as a result, Francis Williams in history has become a very hated figure, because people know that he bought other Africans as slaves, as they were called then, and nobody can quite understand it and why anyone would do that. But that's who he was. He had been enslaved, he was rich, and he lived like a rich person. As you can see from this portrait, he had all the trappings of being rich. He was interesting because there were people who were trying at the time to prove two different theories about black intelligence. And there are many people who said black people are not intelligent, they can't learn, they're not like us, they said, they're not. And then there were other people who said, we think that if given the same opportunities and the same education and the same chances, of course we can prove that they're like us. So there were some people who were being who became social experiments, and this included Francis Williams. He was he became this. He was mentored by someone called John, the second Duke of Montague, who was one of these people who said, if I give this person the same education as one of our young go-ahead men in Britain, I think I can prove that he can become just like them. If we send him to top university and everything else, that would prove. So Francis Williams came to Britain to go into higher education. He went to grammar school here, and he went to Cambridge, and he did really well. He became a mathematician. He actually tried to study everything. So he became a mathematician, he was a poet, he did classics, he did everything. And he was also quite arrogant. So he wanted to show everybody who he was and what he was. And I think that's what this painting's about. In the records it says artist unknown, but I actually think that this is a self-portrait. If you look at this figure in this painting who had money and could get any artist to paint him, why would he end up looking like this? He's got the funniest features, a very strange looking person. And as a person from the Caribbean myself, I've seen many pictures painted by amateur artists and they look just like this, so it's my own theory that it's a self-portrait. If you look at it, on the top of this picture is a curtain that seems to be opening like a theatre setting, revealing this person. So here he is saying, this is me. In the background, there's a bookcase with the most beautiful leather-bound books. And these leather-bound books at the back have all been identified. You can't see the titles, but people have studied them, and because of that, they can look at the red markings on the spine, and they've worked out who the authors were. And they were all top mathematicians, philosophers, and everything else. Francis, I call him Francis because he's a friend. Francis's hand is placed on a book called Newton's Philosophy. And strangely enough, for someone in a portrait, he's actually pointing at books behind him. It's like, look at me, I've got a massive library. In the painting are two globes. And all the people who've studied this for their doctorates and everything else can tell you all about these particular globes. One of them is a celestial globe, signifying the fact that he studied astronomy and the heavens. And that globe is actually poised above the one that's the terrestrial globe. So everything has assumed a significance in this painting. So the terrestrial globe allegedly shows the Caribbean. If it was big enough, you'd be able to see Jamaica. On the floor are black and white marble tiles, and the people who study this say there's a significance in the black and white marble tiles because Francis Williams is trying to show everybody that he lives in a white world and a black world, but a lot you can use every bit of information to mean something. So he's allegedly living in a black world and a white world. And more than that, he's not standing in a white world or a black world. He's standing in the middle of both. The people say, well, he's trying to show that he belongs to both worlds. One of the reasons why I think this is a self-portrait is because if you look at the dimensions of this person, it just doesn't make any sense. For example, if you start at the top, he's wearing a powdered wig. If he were white, that wig would look fine on him. But there's this person who looks rather silly and was ridiculed for the way he dressed, although he was wearing the finest of fineries. He's wearing a woolen coat with sort of silk trimmings. The buttons are gold, gold thread. He's got the best of everything. He's wearing a waistcoat that's silk and gold, and he's got gold buttons on his clothes. But the dimensions of his body aren't right. So when you get down to his legs, he's wearing wonderful silk stockings, but they're so rumpled and crumpled. They look like they're being worn by Nora Batty. It's like he doesn't. So the theories about these silk stockings is that that the academics have said, well, he's trying to show that he's not a labourer, because if he'd been a labourer in those days, he would have great big bulging muscles, and he needs to show that he's not that. So he's got himself painted in these crumpled tights. The other thing about these tights, one of the other reasons why I think it proves that it was a self-portrait, is that the crumpling is so exaggerated that I think only the painter himself would just add it all just to show that I'm definitely not like a labourer. And if that had been painted by a professional painter, they would have, even if there was a slight crease in his tights, they would have smoothed it out. They wouldn't have made him look like that. So there's so much to look at in this particular painting. In the background, he's standing in a panelled, either a study or a library that it's probably his. And it depends on where you think he is, where this painting is, because he lived in England for a lot of the time, but he also lived in Jamaica. You can see in the back of this image what could either be a painting or a window. If you think that this was painted in England, that is a painting, that background is a painting of Jamaica to remind him of where he came from. But if you think that this painting was painted in Jamaica, he's looking through a window. I think that what he has a sort of persona that for me makes me very sad, because for me it signifies someone who lived in the wrong time and the wrong place, because he was so out of place in England. At the time he lived in England, it was calculated there were only about 15,000 black people in the country, most of whom were in London, some of whom were in Liverpool and Bristol, places where the ships arrived. But most people would never have seen a black person. And there's this person who looked like that, and nobody could make any sense of him. Eventually he returned to the Caribbean, and he tried to get into Parliament there, but they hated him there more than they hated him in England, because he just didn't fit in. He had been a very rich person. He inherited a lot of money, but he, unlike his siblings, didn't use his money to make more money. So all his money sort of dwindled away. And eventually he was paying rent, and the little money he had left, he set up a school to try to train young black people to become like him. But I think I like him very much, because for me there's something real about him. In a fairy tale way, there's something real about Francis Williams, and it must have been very, very sad for him. But in all of that sadness, he was apparently one of the most arrogant people you could ever meet, and he was hated by everybody as a result. I think over the years of doing these tours, two of the points that have sprung out at me and surprised me in a way are things that I can't really forget. One of them is that in reality, we as people from the Caribbean, if we are from an enslaved background and it's an enslaved ancestry, I've mentioned it before, don't have a culture of owning antiques, because as I've said before, most of the things that could have been passed down to their descendants just didn't last. They weren't. They weren't. You know, you don't keep a dress, a skirt that you are given as an enslaved person every 6 months. It just doesn't last. So there is no history, no culture of owning antiques. And the second thing that really sprung out at me and really surprised me, and I was so surprised that I began to ask everybody if this is true. And some of my friends and colleagues are coming back and saying, I've been asking my relatives about this, and this particular point is true to my surprise. And that is that most people of my parents' generation and way beyond had no knowledge of their history of being enslaved. It was us, people of my generation, who were going to school and beginning to look at Black history and hearing about, when I was younger, hearing about the fight for education about Black culture in America. That was where I first heard about it. Angela Davis was my heroine, you know, and hearing about all these fighters trying to talk about Black history in America and thinking, oh, that's interesting, and not knowing that we had a similar history in the Caribbean. So that's what sparked it all off. So we began to go home and ask our parents, did you know anything about this? And they said no. So it's only now we have been educating them in the history, and now people talk about it. But since I found this out, I've been asking everyone, they've been asking all their friends, and we're learning even now that people had never been educated in this, had no knowledge of it. Yes, there was a very traditional Victorian education system, and everybody had to do sort of English, British exams, but the history was always British. And the way they managed to subjugate the people who had already been enslaved was not to inform them of anything. And because the people in the Caribbean, their history was mostly oral history, after your grandmother dies and nobody's talking about it, and eventually nobody talks about it. So going down into history, there was nothing. So I think we as Black people know more about our history now than we ever did. And people are desperate to find out as they go along.